Hi guys, so in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about the 4F responses and a little bit about what I've been learning from Pete Walker's book on curing or surviving and thriving and curing PTSD. I really recommend that book. So if you're interested in this content, feel free to like and subscribe. If you would like private coaching, go to www.coachcat.org. That's cat with a K. So what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to be going off these notes, and this is very it's not scripted, so forgive me if I stumble a bit. But what I'm going to talk about is, the trauma response, the PTSD response, and sort of what's happening in your nervous system and your brain, as well as your emotional system. So what can happen if you've had childhood trauma or you've had some intense trauma is you can have this sort of shame-filled perfectionism or fear-filled sort of feel like catastrophizing, and your brain will go to that sort of Chicken Little place of like the sky is falling and you're very hyper vigilant and you're looking out for danger and you're trying to like prevent some future danger from happening. And this can actually manifest when sometimes if you're getting to you could be getting sort of emotionally close to somebody, and then it triggers your sort of PTSD, and you can go into the 4Fs: fight, flight, fear, or fawn response, and you can start catastrophizing about the future and about who they are and about what's happening. Or you can be filled with this shame-filled perfectionism where you think that you have to be perfect in order to be loved, or that love is earned and you've got to earn love and you're not worthy and you're not valuable. So these are just some of the things that can happen, in our little traumatized brain. And really a lot of that is sort of the defense against that abandonment depression. So like if I'm filled with shame and if I'm filled with fear and I'm filled with anger, then I'm not having the true core feeling, which is that sort of deep depression. And what'll happen often is when you go into the 4F response, the fight, flight, fear, or freeze response, what you're doing is you're actually disassociating. You're disassociating from the painful voice of that inner critic that's in your head that's catastrophizing. And this response of fight, flight, fear, or fawn allows some distance from that internal inner critic. So the deep inner fear underlying all of this, that fight, flight, fear, fawn, is this abandonment fear, this abandonment wound, this abandonment depression. That's what we'll call it. And this was typically created in childhood, right? And it was created when our parents either physically abandon us, emotionally abandon us, or psychologically abandon us in whatever way. Sometimes it's a physical abandonment. The parent leaves the child and completely just exits their life. Other times it could even be from death. Or it could be in the case of, if your parent has emotionally abandoned you due to abuse or neglect, or, they're neglecting you, whatever way it is an abandonment. And if you think about it, like people pleasing, that's the fawn response. That is like self-abandonment. So it's like you were abandoned as a child by your parental figure, and then you continue that sort of cycle of abandonment by self-abandoning, by people pleasing, and not being your true self. And as our recovery increases, what we can do to counteract this disassociating is we can start staying present. And I personally will say that this is it's very challenging for me. I'm learning some new methods, and I'm trying to learn ways to do this, but this is just something that has been particularly challenging for me, because when my fight, flight, fear, fawn response kicks in, for me, it's usually it's flight or fawn. First, I'll be very codependent and I'll try to people please. I'll try to not rock the boat. I'll try to accommodate. I'll say yes when I really mean no. And then if that doesn't work to sort of manage the scary other, then what I will do is I'll flight. If it gets too, if the trigger gets too intense, then I have to, I flight, right? So what can happen is if we can learn some of these mindfulness techniques, so we can learn to calm down our nervous system enough to sort of arrest that fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And really, again, what's underneath that is this deep abandonment wound, this abandonment fear, this abandonment depression. And fear and shame are sort of on top of that. But underneath the fear and shame is that sort of abandonment core wound of, that started with parental abandonment and continues with our self-abandonment. And so parental abandonment does create the pathway for self-abandonment. And what happens is, again, we learn to disassociate when we were children, when our parental figure was abandoning us, because we were not actually developmentally capable of managing that pain of abandonment, the fear and anxiety that came from it. We could not tolerate the fear, the shame, and that inconsolable grief from that original abandonment. So what we did is, we started to self-abandon. So we weren't able to manage it. So we started to disassociate as children. And we could not use in real time anger or tears at that time to release the shame and fear. We just couldn't do it, right? And a friend of mine was talking about how animals will go out and and I think might be from Pete Walker's other book, where they'll go out and they start they're being chased down by the saber-toothed tiger or whatever, and the gazelle will after they've survived, they'll go into the woods by themselves and they'll just start convulsing and shaking and shuddering and getting that trauma out of their body somatically. They do that, and that's to release that terror, right? That's to release that trauma. As humans, it would probably behoove us to do that, but I don't think we have that. We don't have that ingrained in us to do that. It's something that we would have to almost learn. I almost wonder if you're in an abandonment trigger, if you're in that fight, flight, fear, fawn response, if you just go and do some crazy boogie shake, go shake your booty. I mean, put on some music and dance. I know that is actually one of the things I do to help me with my depression and anxiety is I do a lot of dancing. I'll put on music and I'll dance and I'll sing, even though I don't feel like it. My mom taught me how to, if you're sad and you're depressed, if you can actually start fake laughing, it will turn into a real laugh. And she does that, and I do that sometimes. It's pretty hilarious, but you feel really silly doing it, but it can be very helpful. So again, when we were little kids, we couldn't use anger or tears or somatically shaking it out of our body to release that shame and fear. And again, we could not bear to stay tuned into this incessantly persecuting critic that was our parent. Now, whether or not that critic was just doing it through detachment or disgust or disdain or a look on their face or a tone in their voice, it didn't mean that it was overt. But when we were little, 0 to 5, we were powerless. And we could only use the 4F response, the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And, if you read the literature, it talks about how chronic emotional abandonment is devastating to children. I mean, you could grow up in the most beautiful house with the most beautiful cars. It could be all clean, nice dinners. Your basic needs were met. Your needs for money and food and shelter were met, but you might have had devastating emotional abandonment. You might have had a parent that was so detached and uninterested in your emotional well-being that you had this emotionally impoverished childhood. That could be the case. Or you could have grown up in a family that where, like more like I did, where there was a lot of chaos, there was a lot of violence, there was a lot of, this physical, verbal, psychological, and emotional abuse and sexual abuse. So you could have grown up where there was like all of those things. So whatever it is, the bottom line is chronic emotional abandonment on any level is devastating to children. And the thing is that functional parents that are well themselves and healthy, they can respond to a child's fear with tuning in with compassion and comfort and awareness, right? They can do that. But if the parent has their own mental illness or addiction or narcissism or whatever they have, they may be chronically emotionally abandoning their children. And again, that's devastating. Abandoning parents respond to the child with anger, disgust, abandonment, withdrawal, detachment, disdain. That is really difficult for children to experience that. And our original experience of parental abandonment actually quite often will morph into habitual self-abandonment. And the thing is we can gradually start to deconstruct the self, and this deconstruct this sort of self-abandoning habit of sort of reaching for depression and dealing with our depression with fear and the shame and that inner critic and catastrophizing and the 4Fs of acting out, the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And the cure to this, what is the cure to it? Well, one really effective cure is mindfulness. And I will be the first to say that even in this point in my journey, like I definitely struggle with this. So I'm not saying for a second that I have this mastered, like not even close. But mindfulness does awaken the psyche to respond to the depression and the sort of catastrophizing before you go into that fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And it does this through self-compassion and self-nurturing, right? So we need to be able to tap into our self-compassion to counteract that inner critic that's telling us that we're not good enough, we're not lovable, we have to earn love, etc., etc. So it can help us to end the reactivity to depression, and it can help us to sort of not go into that 4F response. And, the thing is, our culture really looks at depression like it's very stigmatized. It looks at it as a vulnerability, as a weakness. It's very taboo for you to acknowledge that you might have depression in our society. I mean, obviously it's getting better, but it's sort of like, we shame people for being depressed or for being grieving or for being sad. Like we shame them socially. Yes, there are outliers. There are people who don't agree with this. There are great therapists who, will support you in that. But, in general, our society looks at depression as a weakness. And it's a natural human feeling, actually. And the thing about mindfulness, and I'm going to do more videos on this as I learn more, but basically it metabolizes depression. And it's sort of like, if you get to this place of deep level recovery from trauma, it requires that you normalize your depression, you normalize the grief, and it can help you to sort of counteract that habit of reflectively being in this place of reaction, this place of fight, flight, fear, fawn response. And if you're able to be mindful, practice mindfulness, which is really about staying present. And again, this is hypocritical of me because this is stuff I'm still working on. I don't have this mastered, but I know that this is what Pete Walker talks about. I know that this is what a lot of the really good psychologists and philosophers talk about in terms of helping to manage you going into that sort of trauma response. And for sure, central to all of this is that development of really compassionate mindfulness and self-nurturing. And mindfulness, what is it? Well, it's not even, you don't even have to look at it like a religion or spiritual practice or any spiritual practice or anything like that. You can just simply look at it as mindfulness is the practice of staying in your body, the practice of staying fully present in the moment rather than catastrophizing, rather than future tripping, rather than ruminations on the past, and staying present for all of your internal experience. It's the practice of staying present, and it allows you to open up to your true sort of physical and somatic experiences. And it allows you to stay present for your true in the moment sort of emotional experiences, rather than being triggered into the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, rather than disassociating, which is what we often do when we're trauma survivors. And it cultivates, this mindfulness practice will help to cultivate your ability to stay present without retreating into that reactivity. Somatic mindfulness is staying present for your physical symptoms of hyperarousal, and stopping yourself from that sort of disassociation. So I'm going to make some more videos on this. The more I explore, the more I learn, and I'm really starting to commit to myself to get into a much more regular practice of mindfulness and meditation. I used to have that very sort of not religiously, but very a good meditation practice and a very consistent yoga practice. I used to practice like 4 or 5 times a week, and then I was practicing at home and meditating and doing yoga. But in the state of my sort of my trauma from being in the sort of narcissistically abusive relationship, what happened for me was I ended up going into really a lot of flight and fawn responses, and I was really in my triggered state. And when I most needed, the practice of being present, when I most needed to be mindful, when I most needed yoga, when I most needed those things, I least availed myself to them, unfortunately, because I was so triggered, I was in such that state, and I wasn't able to sort of harness those good practices that I had developed previously, because some of it was just logistical, because I was moving and I was being displaced from my home of 10 years, and all of these things were happening. But this is something that I don't know where you're at in this stage, but even if you can commit to yourself that you're going to do 5 minutes of meditation a day. You can use like an app, a meditation app, or guided. There's some on YouTube. There's like guided meditations for trauma and PTSD. Like if you can commit to, even 5 minutes a day, I think it would be really beneficial to do that. And that's, sort of staying present, staying in the moment, and not letting that drunk monkey brain sort of take over and like run the show, because it doesn't get to run the show. Your trauma does not get to be the boss, and that's about you taking really shifting into learning how to kind of manage your nervous system, and deep breathing and meditation and yoga. So thanks so much for listening, guys, and I hope that you are thriving. I hope that you are practicing radical self-care, and I hope you're having a beautiful, beautiful day. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.